we talked about satiety and things and weight loss. And now I'm just going to talk about a few different functional lipids and how they can impact, firstly on exercise performance and then on weight loss. And firstly, going to talk about medium-chain triglycerides, and they've been strongly implicated, first off, for exercise performance. So I'm briefly going to talk about that. Then I'm going to talk about their effect on weight loss. And then I'm going to talk about some other functional lipids, like structural triglycerides, diacylglycerol, conjugated linoleic acid, and short-chain triglycerides. So, medium-chain triglycerides are triglycerides that have a fatty acid length of between 6 and 12 carbons. So if we see here, you can see the glycerol backbone, and you can see the 3 fatty acids attached to it, and they're obviously a lot shorter, whereas long-chain fatty acids are 12 or more than 12. We can see capric acid here, only 6, caprylic 8, and capric 10. So medium-chain triglycerides obviously differ in structure to long-chain triglycerides, and long-chain triglycerides are the type of triglycerides you usually get in your diet. So they're what you consume most of the time. They differ not just in their structure, but also in how they're handled by the body. Firstly, in the gastrointestinal tract, they're not as reliant on bile for emulsification. So we know that when fats empty into the small intestine, they need to be emulsified before they can be digested and absorbed. This study that we did, we looked at the amount of sugars released from different pancakes. Do you know what pancakes are? Yeah? Okay. From different pancakes after they had been digested in vitro. So basically we digested them in a test tube. And we had a control, a pancake with added butter, sunflower oil, olive oil, and medium-chain triglycerides. And what we found was the sugars released at the start, so before we started digesting, were the same for the different fats. Then, once we got to the gastric phase, we saw that a lot more sugars were released for the medium-chain triglycerides, whereas for the 3 other fats, there weren't as much released. However, 120 minutes into the intestinal digestive phase, we found that they'd all had the same amount of sugars were being released. And what this shows us is that during the gastric phase, the pancake can be broken down for the medium-chain triglycerides because the fats aren't reliant on bile. They're more water-soluble, and it could cause the pancake structure to break down and release the sugars. Whereas 120 minutes into the intestinal phase, the bile had been added to our test tube, and this caused the release of the sugars later on. So basically what I'm trying to say is that medium-chain triglycerides are water-soluble, and they don't rely on bile for emulsification. They also, if you remember back to one of my previous slides, I talked about the hormone CCK. Well, CCK, as I said, is released in response to long-chain triglycerides, but it's not released in response to medium-chain triglycerides. So if you remember, CCK delays gastric emptying, increased bile secretion, and increased pancreatic secretion. So the CCK that's released, obviously for MCTs, we don't need bile. We'll go on and talk more about, aren't as reliant on the pancreatic enzymes. Well, they don't need the bile to get near the pancreatic enzymes. And also they empty much more rapidly from the stomach because they don't have CCK causing this delay in gastric emptying. So the CCK isn't really released. They empty much faster from the stomach. They don't need bile because they're water soluble. They're also absorbed much more differently as well. So during digestion, MCT are converted to medium-chain fatty acids, and normally our triglycerides are absorbed as a monoglycerol and 2 fatty acids. They're repackaged into chylomicrons, and then they're transported via the lymphatic system past all the other tissues, like the adipose tissue, where they can be absorbed, and then they're brought to the liver. Whereas medium-chain triglycerides are just transported via the portal vein directly to the liver. So they get to the liver much more quickly. They empty quicker, they digest quicker, they get to the liver much more quickly. In addition, medium-chain fatty acids can cross the mitochondrial membrane of the liver independent of the acylcarnitine transfer system. So if we look here, we have our triacylglycerol. and it's reliant on this system here, the acylcarnitine transfer system, whereas medium chain triglycerides can transfer into the hepatocyte and straight across the mitochondrial wall without being reliant on this. So they're a much more readily available energy source. So in exercise, one thing that endurance athletes really strive to do is to maintain their glycogen stores. So they want to maintain their glycogen stores so that they can continue their exercise at the same level throughout the same intensity throughout the exercise period. And this way improve their race times. So what's been thought of is that a way to keep your glycogen stores throughout the exercise period would be to use other sources of energy, not use your glycogen stores up. So for example, using your fat stores or ingesting fat. So in low to moderate exercise, fat oxidation increases 5 to 10 times from resting. So it increases, if we look here, we see 25% exercise intensity, to 65% exercise intensity to 85%. And we can see the fat oxidation increases with the 65% and decreases again at higher intensity exercises. So fat is a really good source of energy during this moderate intensity exercise. And the fitter the individual, the better they're able to use their fat stores or their available fat. However, we know that long-chain triglycerides, they empty much more slowly from the stomach. They take a long time to travel through the lymphatic system. They take a long time to be transferred across the liver. So they're just a poor source of readily available energy. Whereas it was thought that medium chain triglycerides don't have all these problems. They could be great. So, studies on medium chain triglycerides and exercise, however, haven't been so good so far. The results haven't been successful in improving exercise performance in athletes. Even when the glycogen stores have been depleted prior to exercise, so they've exercised the people to get rid of their glycogen stores, they have found that MCT doesn't influence fat oxidation. One of the reasons for this is that MCTs have really bad side effects in that they cause feelings of nausea, feelings of bloatedness when you're given high doses. These are doses of about 70 grams of MCTs. So you can see here in this study, they fed a carbohydrate beverage, a carbohydrate and MCT beverage, an MCT beverage and a placebo beverage. And they took ratings of nausea, belching, bloatedness, headache or dizziness, and gastrointestinal cramping. And they took them at the end of 120 minutes of exercise and at the end of a 15-minute time trial, so exercise to exhaustion for 15 minutes. And what they found was that in the placebo, we can see the ratings are all really low. For the carbohydrates, they're increased slightly, but when we get to the carbohydrates and MCTs, especially for here bloated feelings and for gastrointestinal cramping, you can see the levels increase a lot. When you're exercising, you don't really want to have feelings of nausea or cramping. It's not going to increase your exercise performance. So one method that was used to try to alleviate this problem was to combine it with carbohydrate. And this seems to have worked in some studies, but not all. So this study here is the one I referred to back here. And obviously we can see that they reported having bad gastrointestinal cramping. So it obviously wasn't positive there. This study by Angus et al., they used a placebo, carbohydrate and MCT. And they found that the carbohydrate oxidation was increased following the carbohydrate and MCT. So this is the carbohydrate and MCT here. And the carbohydrate oxidation was increased. And they found that fat oxidation here was decreased in the carbohydrate and MCT. So this is exactly the opposite to what we'd expect, because we want to increase fat oxidation. We don't want to increase carbohydrate oxidation. However, they did find an increase in performance associated with this. Well, they didn't find an increase in performance. Sorry, forget that. They didn't find an increase in performance. And this is probably due to the carbohydrate being the thing that was increasing the effect as opposed to the MCT. So the carbohydrate was having the effect, not the actual MCTs. Another study with co-ingestion of MCT and carbohydrate found that with the MCT and carbohydrate, they found this increase in plasma glucose here. at rest, but not during exercise. And it didn't result in any changes in glycogen oxidation. So once again, we don't necessarily want to see the increase in blood glucose or in carbohydrate oxidation. What we wanted to see was an increase in fat oxidation to spare the glucose oxidation. And this wasn't seen here. So when they put the MCT and carbohydrate together, the take-home point is that the carbohydrate mixed with the MCT will increase the performance, but the MCT alone isn't having any effect. There have been some positive studies. This Van Zyl one is possibly the only study using MCTs that found that MCTs alone have increased performance. They used a high-dose MCT, and I'm a bit dubious about the results because every other study has found ones that oppose it. And they found the time trial performance was best with carbohydrate and MCT, then carbohydrate, and then MCT alone. This study by Duke and Droop found that more MCT were oxidized when consumed in combination with carbohydrate. So if we look down here, we can see the amount of exogenous MCT used. And then we can see when it was mixed with carbohydrate, it increases, almost doubles. But when you look at the overall picture of how much is oxidized, you can see that it's quite small. And here we see the oxidation rates of exogenous MCT compared to when just MCT was given alone. However, they didn't find any changes in performance either. So it didn't have an impact there. There have been a few studies done where they fed high medium chain triglyceride diets or high fat diets and MCTs and looked at the effect of exercise. This one study by Godek, they looked at a 10-day high fat diet. This high fat diet was long chain triglycerides. And they fed, before the time trial, an exercise performance time trial, they found that they fed an MCT emulsion. And they found that the muscle glycogen oxidation was reduced from 1.5 down to 1. And, 1.5 down to 1. And, but they believed that this wasn't due to the MCTs itself in the emulsion. It was mostly due to the high-fat diet, not due to the MCTs. Or that's what they believe. And Asaka et al. Placed volunteers on a 14-day diet where they consumed just 6 grams MCT per day. And they found that exercise time to exhaustion improved compared to long-chain triglycerides. However, we must remember in the study they didn't compare MCTs to what would be their usual comparison, would be carbohydrates. They compared it to LCTs. So if they compared it to carbohydrates, I doubt they would have the same effect because we know that LCTs aren't really a good source of energy as an exogenous source during exercise. So what we know is that for exercise, MCTs are a bit useless. However, they have other uses, and we're going to look at their effect on weight loss now. So the positive effects of MCT on energy balance and health effects have been vastly researched. And the reason is they have a rapid transit into the body. We know that their gastric emptying rates are much faster. They have a lack of deposition into the adipose tissue because they go directly from the small intestine to the liver. They don't go through the lymphatic system. They don't go past the adipose tissue, so they can't be taken up there. And they have an increased metabolism that results in an increased energy expenditure, and they have an earlier satiety. The earlier studies that were done on MCTs, these all were over 1 day. So what we see is the effects looking at things like diet-induced thermogenesis, which we talked about earlier, where we see this increase in energy expenditure following a food due to the digestion, absorption, assimilation of that food. And what we see here in this study by Scalfi is this increase in energy expenditure following MCTs compared to LCTs. And they found this effect both in obese and in lean individuals. So you can see in the obese individuals this increase here as well. And another study showing similar results by Seaton et al. They showed an increase in oxygen consumption with MCTs compared to LCTs. So what we see with MCTs is this increase in energy expenditure postprandially. So that's good in the short term. Do these effects have long-term implications? Let's have a look. So first I'm going to talk about satiety. They've been shown to increase energy expenditure during one day, but they've also been shown to have an influence on food intake. So we talked about preloads earlier. So we give a preload, amount of a certain food, and then we look at their ad libitum food intake in a test meal, where they're given free rein of how much food they want to eat. And here we can see they fed a preload of 100 kilocalories of either LCT in white or MCT in black. And they fed 100 kilocalories, 200 kilocalories, and 300 kilocalorie doses. And across all 3 kilocalorie doses, we can see there was a reduced food intake with the MCT compared to LCT groups. And a similar study by, I can't pronounce this very well, Van Wijmelbeck, and they looked at the effect of either a fat substitute, 1,200 kilojoules of LCT, 1,200 kilojoules of MCT, or a mixture of carbohydrate and LCT. And they found the food intake was decreased after the MCT meal. So if we look here, we can see the amount of food intake consumed, and we can see it was only 3,600 kilocalories after the MCT compared to 4,100 after the LCT. So as I said a minute ago, these effects have been shown over one day. What happens after one day? Well, after 7 days, this study by White, they placed people on a 7-day MCT diet. And we can see here this energy expenditure postprandially after 7 days. And we can see that the MCT still has this elevated energy expenditure postprandially. What we also see after a 7-day diet is an increase in their basal metabolic rate. So even when they're at rest, they're expending more energy. So throughout the whole day, they will be expending more energy, which means that there's a greater chance they could be losing weight. And we can see this is a significant response here. However, after 14 days, you can see that these two lines are much closer together. Though they were actually significantly greater for the MCT group overall, but the basal metabolic rate was not significant. So there seems to be an effect whereby after 14 days, it's starting to wear off. Similarly, in this study by Saint-Onge, they looked at energy expenditure at 2 days and 28 days after into MCT diet compared to an LCT diet on fat oxidation and on energy expenditure and on fat oxidation. And they found after 2 days there were significant differences in both energy expenditure and fat oxidation, but after 28 days these differences were not significant. So you can tell it is greater, it's just not significantly greater. However, in saying that, we see the effects do wear off, but this study is probably the longest weight loss study using MCTs. And after 16 weeks, we're still seeing decreases in body weight following an MCT diet. So this is the MCT diet weight loss over 16 weeks and the LCT weight loss diet over 16 weeks, olive oil. And we can see that there's rapid weight loss at the start of the diet for both diets. However, for both diets, it does start to plateau. But with the MCT group, it is greater. So, what are the positives associated with consuming MCTs as part of a weight loss diet? Well, we can see the weight loss that we saw just there. It's obviously much greater than having olive oil added to it, the diet. The satiety we saw in the other studies, that it increases satiety, which will decrease food intake. So increases energy expenditure, it decreases food intake. And also it has an effect on glucose and insulin responses. So if we look down here at the HOMA score, which is an indication of insulin resistance, we can see that after the MCT diet for 90 days, there's a decrease in this HOMA score here. So that's another positive. So basically, MCTs are great. Increased satiety, decreased food intake, alters glucose and insulin levels positively. What could go wrong? Well, unfortunately, there's some negatives. This study looked at a 28-day diet of MCT or high oleic acid sunflower oil. And they found with the MCTs, there was an 11% increase in total cholesterol, 12% increase in LDL cholesterol, 32% increase in VLDL, and 12% increase in LDL-HDL ratio. So it's not all good for blood lipids for MCTs. However, there's been one study done, again by this person, Saint-Onge. She's done a lot of the research around MCTs. And what they did was they came up with this functional oil. The functional oil contained flaxseed oil in it. And the idea was that it was hoped it would counteract any negative effects associated with MCTs. So they published this work as 2 studies. The first study was looking at weight loss. The other study was looking at the cardiovascular effects. And here we can see with the functional oil compared to the olive oil, which is generally considered to be a good oil for cardiovascular health. They compared the functional oil to the olive oil, and they found that total adipose tissue, subcutaneous adipose tissue, and upper body adipose tissue were all reduced compared to the olive oil. Also, what they found was there was no differences in any of the parameters, such as total cholesterol, HDL cholesterol, between the 2 diets. So in essence, they thought that they solved the problem in terms of MCTs by adding in this flaxseed oil. Another study by Simeons et al., what they did is they combined MCTs with fish oil. This study wasn't done for weight loss. It was a parenteral nutrition study. It was trying to reduce the effects on endothelial problems associated with people who are being fed parenterally. And they similarly had positive results. Another negative is that it appears from some of the studies that have been done that the data shows that the energy expenditure in lean individuals tends to be greater than the energy expenditure in obese individuals. So if we look here, we have the difference in energy expenditure between MCT and LCT. So obviously we want the energy expenditure to be greater for the MCT, or the difference between MCT and LCT to be greater. And we have initial body weight. And what we see is that for a lower body weight, the difference in energy expenditure is greater. At a higher body weight, the difference in energy expenditure is lower. And what this indicates, sorry, this is 2 days, this is 28 days, the same response is seen. This indicates that perhaps MCTs might be much more useful for weight maintenance or maybe moderate weight loss as opposed to in obese individuals where the differences don't seem to be as great. Another negative is that St. Ange and Jones highlight that the energy expenditure in males is quite high, so with MCTs compared to LCTs, and they calculated averaging out these studies here to be 460 kilojoules per day. Whereas when they looked at 2 studies in females, they found that the energy expenditure was only 138 and 188 kilojoules per day. So they emphasized that perhaps it works better in males than it does in females. However, I looked at another study that they did after they made this point, and they published another study themselves in 2003. And when you average out their energy expenditure that they calculate following 28 days of feeding, in females, the energy expenditure is 300 kilojoules per day. So perhaps this effect actually doesn't exist. It may just be that these 2 studies did not find as good a result. Okay, so that's MCTs we've talked about. I'm going to move on to a few other types of functional lipids. The first one I'm briefly going to talk about is structured triglycerides. Structured triglycerides are triglycerides that contain both medium-chain fatty acids and long-chain fatty acids on the one glycerol backbone. So here we see the glycerol molecule with 2 medium-chain fatty acids and 1 long-chain fatty acid. And what we see is with these is that they have some of the advantages of MCTs without some of the disadvantages that MCTs have. So they have a higher smoke point, which means that they can be used in cooking and frying and things like that. And they also increase energy expenditure, and they can help with weight loss. But they don't have the same effects on blood lipids like cholesterol. And most of the studies that have been done, a lot of them have been Japanese studies, and they have shown significant weight loss. Another type of functional lipid is diacylglycerol, or DAG. Diacylglycerol consists of 2 fatty acids covalently bonded to a glycerol molecule. So here we see a triacylglycerol. This is our glycerol backbone, and these are 3 fatty acids. Whereas for DAG, we only have 2 fatty acids. So 1, 2, and 1 and 2 here. There's 3 ways in which diacylglycerols can be arranged. We can have a 1,2, a 1,3, or a 2,3, obviously. But And there's two ways in which diacylglycerols can exist. One, we can get them from our diet, and two, we can, they occur naturally during digestion. So when you digest a triacylglycerol, what happens is, first of all, the intermediary process is that you have either a 1,2 diacylglycerol or a 2,3 diacylglycerol. Slide away. So you will always have, in the digestive process, you'll always have fatty acid in the 2 position on the glycerol backbone. However, when we get it from our diet, it'll always be this type of diacylglycerol, 1,3. So diacylglycerol is similar in taste, appearance, and fatty acid composition to other oils. It's found naturally in some oils. There's 0.85% in rapeseed oil, and I think there's 9% in cottonseed oil. And it has a similar energy expenditure to triacylglycerols. So you can see the energy expenditure, 38.9 compared to 39.6. And as I said, it can be easily incorporated into other foods because the taste is quite similar. So after ingestion of triacylglycerol, as I just said, either 1,2 diacylglycerol are produced or 2,3. So the fatty acids are either in the 1,2 position or in the 2,3 position. And this is an intermediate metabolic process in the digestive tract. This is then further broken down into 2 fatty acids and 1 monoglycerol. So they always end up in the monoglycerol with the fatty acid attached in that 2 position. So if we look at here, we have our triacylglycerol, gets taken into the small intestine, the 1,3 lipase attacks it, and we end up with, in this example, 2,3 diacylglycerol or 1,2 diacylglycerol, and then we end up 2 monoglycerols, or a monoglycerol and 2 fatty acids. This gets incorporated into a chylomicron, transported by the lymphatic system, similar to how we talked about when we were talking about MCTs. Diacylglycerol, however, something different happens to it. So it only has the fatty acids in the 1 and 3 position. This is when it comes from the diet. When the lipase attacks it, what we end up with is 2 fatty acids and a glycerol. Because there's no monoglycerol left, the chylomicron cannot be reformed. Because it can't be reformed, it can't get incorporated into a chylomicron and transported in the lymphatic system. So instead, similar to MCTs, it gets transported in the portal vein directly to the liver. So in a similar way to how MCTs were digested and absorbed, it just gets immediately transported and passes by all these peripheral tissues like the adipose tissue. So it can't be absorbed into the adipose tissue. Does everyone understand that? Do you want me to go through it again? No? Will you say if you do? Yeah? Okay. So there's been some good studies showing positive effects of diacylglycerol. I'm going to call it DAG from now on because it'll be a lot easier, of DAG on body fat compared to triacylglycerol. This study here shows percentage changes in body weight, BMI, waist circumference, and also in fat areas compared to the triacylglycerol group over here. Another study here, so this one was only across 16 weeks. This one's across 24 weeks. And similarly, we can see the change in weight from baseline compared to this is the triacylglycerol, and this is the DAG oil. And see here we can see the change in fat mass across the time period for triacylglycerol and then for diacylglycerol. However, not all studies have shown these differences. And we can see in this study, this was only a 12-week study, so shorter than the others, but we see that there was no significant differences between the diacylglycerol and the control group. And we can see body weight, for example, didn't really change at all across this time point. This is a review paper showing the changes in body weight of a large number of studies. And we can see that the major results here are that the majority of studies showed a decrease either body fat or body weight. However, some studies didn't find any change between the two. One problem with DAG oil that has concerned people is whether it's safe. Like we talked about MCTs and we talked about their effect on lipid profiles. Is it safe to eat DAG? Is it safe to eat them in large quantities? And do they influence fat absorption or fat-soluble vitamin absorption? Well, this study by Yusung et al. Designed a 12-week trial to examine the effect of high doses of DAG oil. So they gave 0.5 grams per kg body weight. So if we look back here to this study, we can see the doses given. This one here gave 20, but the rest of them are quite a lot lower, 13. This is the one I'm talking about, so just ignore that one. 10, 8 to 9, 9.8. So if you think of 0.5 grams per kg, that's 35 grams for a 70 kg male, which is quite a lot of oil compared to the other studies. Most of the MCT studies were given about 10 to 20 grams as well, not much more than that. So here we can see that the 12-week trial fed quite a large amount of diacylglycerol. And they compared it again to triacylglycerol. And what they found was there was no differences in the cholesterol parameters across the two. There's a slight difference here between the two, but if you look and compare the DAG, which is the lower line, you can see that from week 0, it was 93.7, and the only change, the tag decreased slightly. Oh yeah, okay. So there's a difference between the two, the diacyl and triacylglycerol, but there's no difference across time really. So as in it went from 93 to 97.1, it didn't really increase significantly. It increased slightly, but that was not significant. The significant difference was between the two groups, and that was because the triacylglycerol decreased from 93 to 86. So what we're saying is that the diacylglycerol doesn't seem to have any negative effect on cardiovascular risk profiles. So another study that looked at the bioavailability of fat-soluble vitamins gave people 20 grams of DAG or TAG for 12 weeks, and they found no change in vitamin A concentrations. They did find differences in vitamin E and D at some time points, but they weren't significantly different. And what they concluded was that DAG oil does not affect the absorption of fat-soluble vitamins. However, we need to always think about these things. When we talk about any functional foods, we need to think about how they can interact with each other and how the long-term effects. So this is 12 weeks, but what would the effect be over 3 years, 10 years, or longer than that? Also, when we talk about functional foods and functional food ingredients, eating foods that we wouldn't necessarily eat in large quantities, how can they impact on our diet, and how can they impact on other nutrients? Like we talk about drug interactions, but we also have to think about food-food interactions and whether these can have effects. And obviously, a lot of this isn't known with some foods. So another type of functional lipid I'm going to talk to you about is conjugated linoleic acid, or CLA. So CLA are a family of at least 28 isomers of linoleic acid. So they're a type of linoleic acid, and they're mainly found in the meat and dairy products derived from the chewing cud of mammals called ruminants. Does anyone know what a ruminant is? Anyone want to tell everyone what a ruminant is? You all seem to be whispering stuff. Can someone say it out loud? You guys down the back, you seem to know the answer. No? No? The stomach? What happens? What do ruminants do when they digest food? Yeah, sorry. What do they do when they digest food? How do ruminants digest their food? Yeah.
And then the CLA are spread to cold milk, cold fat, and cold
Yeah. So
then we have conjugated linoleic acid in our diet.
yeah. So what do ruminants do? Did I see you? I saw you making actions. Yeah, they regurgitate it and then swallow it back down again. Yeah. So they will chew the food, swallow it into their stomach, allow it to be partially digested then, and then regurgitate it and chew it again. Not very nice, really. So conjugated linoleic fatty acids are polyunsaturated fatty acids in which at least one pair of double bonds is separated by only one single bond. So for example, here we see linoleic acid, but it's separated by 1 and 2 double bonds. Whereas here we see CLA is only separated by 1 double bond and 1 double bond here. And conjugated linoleic acids are thought to influence body composition by a variety of mechanisms, but they're not very sure what the mechanisms are. They have an idea of some of the mechanisms, but the full extent of the mechanisms are unknown. One way is that they reduce lipid accumulation through its effect on lipoprotein lipase, which obviously enhances absorption of lipids, or taking in of lipids into the adipose tissue, and sterile coenzyme A, which helps with the oxidation of lipids. However, much of the mechanisms, as I said, are unknown. This meta-analysis and systemic review looked at the effect of conjugated linoleic acid on weight loss. So what they did is they retrieved 2,864 references. They then excluded the majority of the references because they found that they weren't related to the topic. They ended up with 15 full-text articles, and then they reduced it down to 8 and excluded them based on a variety of things, such as one was an open trial. Does anyone know what an open trial is? What's a blinded trial? So a single blind trial would be whereby the participant doesn't know about the study. An open trial would be whereby everybody knows. So the participant knows what they're doing, what they're taking, and the researcher knows what they're taking. So it's generally not considered good to have an open trial where everybody knows, the participant knows what they're taking. One was only single blind. So in other words, the participant did not know, but the researcher did know. So it's better if the researcher and the participant don't know, and an external person randomizes the trial and gives them the actual supplement that they're taking. 3 were excluded because they involved normal weight individuals, and they wanted to look at obese individuals, or obese and overweight. 1 didn't report body weight, and the hypothesis was to look at body weight, so that wasn't very useful. And 1 was just a duplicate of another study they'd included. So they ended up with 7 studies. What they found was that if we see the mean difference in weight loss for the CLA, we can see it here across the different studies. And what we see here is the mean difference, the mean difference here, weight loss here, for the CLA. We see the mean weight loss here for the placebo. And what we see here is the percentage weight loss, and here we can see the average mean difference between the 2 types. So whether they got a placebo or they had the CLA. So this is the difference here between the CLA and the placebo. And what we can see is that there was a 0.7 kg weight loss associated with the CLA compared to a placebo oil. They also did a dose response curve across the different studies, and they found that you can kind of see a trend that as the dose increases, there's an increase in weight loss, but this was not significant. So what the meta-analysis suggested was that the CLA intake generates statistically significant data to give the idea that weight loss occurs. However, they thought that the magnitude of the effect was not clinically relevant, and because it didn't equate to a 5% weight loss, which a lot of the studies on these haven't equated to. The meta-analysis also suggests that CLA intake generates a small significant decrease in body fat and BMI, but no decrease in waist circumference. The study only involved overweight and obese individuals, and only studies that had 6 months duration, which is obviously quite long. So they excluded quite a lot of studies that had a much shorter duration in it. One other thing about conjugated linoleic acid that they studies is that the type of conjugated linoleic acid that they give in a lot of these studies isn't the type that you find naturally in food. So the food that comes from the ruminants who chew it, it's not the same type as was found in that, and the effects on that haven't been studied in as much detail. The type that they do feed is one that has been made specifically for this purpose, but it's not one that we find naturally in food. So, short-chain fatty acids. This is the last type of functional lipid I'm going to talk about. And this is a relatively new area of research. Short-chain fatty acids are available from two sources. One is the fermentation of non-digestible carbohydrates in the colon, and directly from dietary sources. So when foods are digested in the colon and fermented, they cause the production of short-chain fatty acids. These short-chain fatty acids are believed to increase satiety. Also, short-chain fatty acids occur directly in our food. So short-chain fatty acids are fatty acids that have between 1 and 7 carbons. So we talked earlier about medium-chain fatty acids, we talked about long-chain fatty acids, and these are short-chain fatty acids. The ones that are have primarily been studied are acetate here, which is 2 carbons in length, propanoic acid, which is 3, and butyric acid, which is 4. In terms of sources, natural sources, dietary sources of short-chain fatty acids, and they're particularly found in foods that have been fermented. So they're found in foods that have a strong taste associated with them, a vinegary taste, such as sourdough bread, vinegar, anything that's pickled, so like pickles, or gherkins to anybody who doesn't know what pickles are. That's in there. Or in some dairy products like sour cream, butter or creme fraiche, and some cheeses. Because of the volatility of short-chain fatty acids, they have a really distinct odour and smell and taste, and this can impact when we're looking at doing these type of studies on short-chain fatty acids. So, how do short-chain fatty acids actually increase satiety? Well, in 2003, they discovered 2 orphan G protein receptors, and these are called FFA2 and FFA3. And these are thought to be activated by short-chain fatty acids. FFA2 is equally sensitive to activation by propionate, butyrate, and acetate. However, FFA3 is activated primarily in response to propionate, then to butyrate, and then to acetate. And it's thought that the short-chain fatty acids upregulate leptin expression. So what does leptin do? Yeah, go on. You're right. Decreases food intake, increases satiety. Yeah. And so this is obviously one way in which short-chain fatty acids decrease food intake. FFA2 and FFA3 are believed to be co-localized with the anorexigenic ileal brake gut hormone PYY. So we talked about PYY earlier, and we said it played a role in the ileal brake mechanism, which increases satiety, decreases gastric emptying, and also decreases the secretion of hormones or enzymes. So short-chain fatty acids have been shown to significantly increase blood PYY levels and to reduce gastric motility, so delay gastric emptying, which can have this effect of creating feelings of gastric distension and fullness. And the sensitivity to this increase in PYY levels is believed to be in the order of propionate, butyrate, or acetate. And because this order here is the same as the order up here, it's believed that the FFA3 receptor is implicated. So there's 2 ways in which short-chain fatty acids have had their effects on appetite assessed. The first is both in the oral provision of short-chain fatty acids, so giving people foods that have short-chain fatty acids in them. And the second is in giving people non-digestible carbohydrates, and then the short-chain fatty acids being produced from this. So this is one study that gives really good results on why short-chain fatty acids should be consumed. Here we can see the influence on triglycerides, cholesterol, and LDL and HDL cholesterol. And we can see that after 12 weeks, the triglyceride levels, the total cholesterol levels are significantly reduced. So what they fed was, in this case, they fed acetate in the form of apple vinegar. They fed 2 doses, a 15 milliliter dose and a 30 milliliter dose. So this was placebo, low dose, high dose. And we can see the weight changes across. So this is 4, 8, and 12 weeks. Oh, sorry. It's not. These are changes in body fat. This is subcutaneous fat, visceral fat, and total fat. So what we can see is there's a decrease in the subcutaneous and in the visceral, and even greater in the total fat. So this indicates that short-chain fatty acids, just given to people in small doses of vinegar, can have a large impact on weight loss. So this is acetate, and similarly, the effect has been done in other acetate meals, single acetate meals. However, there's one problem with these studies. The foods that I said they contained in, they all contain vinegary or sourdough or something like that, and this means that they don't have a very palatable taste to everybody, which means that you don't know whether it's the palatability of the meal or the short-chain fatty acid that's impacting. So it's difficult to know whether it's the palatability or whether it's actually the short-chain fatty acids. And also a lot of the studies haven't used visual analog scales. What they've used is the category scales I talked about, and they haven't looked at the quantitative effects. They haven't looked at this ad libitum meal. So it's hard to get proper data from it. With propionate, a different type of short-chain fatty acids, it's been shown to increase satiety and decrease, but they've also found decreased acceptability ratings. So in other words, it had a decreased palatability and it increased people's nausea. So you can't tell in these studies whether or not it's the nausea and things that are stopping people eat, or whether it's actually the short-chain fatty acids. One study, this one, Darcy et al., used a sourdough bread, but they matched the sourdough bread to another bread that had a similar taste and palatability. They gave a really low dose, though, and they found no differences in food intake between the 2 breads. So it's hard for them to tell whether it was the amount that they had too low a dose, or whether it was because it was just palatability effects. So there really needs to be more research in this area because it's such a new area in terms of that. Finally, feeding non-digestible carbohydrates. There has been a lot of data done on this, but again, it's difficult to know whether it's other effects of the non-digestible carbohydrate that are having the effect, like things like delayed gastrointestinal transit, that type of thing that's having the effect, or whether it's the production of short-chain fatty acids that are having the effect. So in that case, it's difficult to separate it. So in essence, this is a really, really new area of research. So it's obviously needs a lot more work to tell whether the production of these short-chain fatty acids are having the effect, whether it's the case that they need to feed them directly to the colon or something like that without having all the other effects that the non-digestible carbohydrate would have. And similarly, getting more studies where they've matched the palatability of the meals. So what we covered today was medium-chain triglycerides. We talked about how bad they were for exercise performance. We discussed how good they were for weight loss. We talked about the positives and negatives associated with consuming them. And then we talked about other functional lipids like structured triglycerides, diacylglycerol, conjugated linoleic acid, and short-chain fatty acids. Okay, and that is it.